Long before foreign flags touched our shores, Africa was rising, building empires, mastering science, shaping trade, and honoring the ancestors. They said we had no history. That was not just a lie. It was a weapon. But we remember. And now we speak. How Africa developed before the coming of the Europeans. Long before the first sails appeared on Africa's coasts, civilizations thrived here. Organized, advanced, and deeply rooted in the soil of the continent. Africa was not a blank canvas awaiting European paint. From the Nile Valley to the Sahelian empires, from the Swahili coast to the Kingdom of Congo, Africa developed in its own image. Societies organized systems of governance, built cities, traded gold and ivory across vast distances, and developed education and culture that rivaled anything in the world. Libraries held thousands of manuscripts. Astronomy and medicine were studied. Trade routes stretched across the Sahara and into the Indian Ocean. The narrative that Africa had no history, that it was primitive until Europe arrived, is one of the greatest lies ever told. These myths were crafted to justify conquest. But the ruins of ancient cities, the oral traditions of nations, and the enduring spirit of African peoples prove otherwise. Africa was not waiting to be discovered. It was already home to wisdom. Africa's development was not identical to Europe's. It was unique. It was deeply connected to land, family, spiritual life, and communal values. To suggest this was somehow inferior is to deny the diversity of human progress. It is to erase civilizations because they did not mirror the colonizers. They told us Africa had no past, so they could steal its future. But the ruins still speak. The rhythms still beat. The truth still lives. What was stolen was never forgotten. The coming of Europe and the roots of exploitation. They did not come to trade as equals. They came with maps, flags, and chains. With every handshake, a knife behind the back. Europe's arrival on African shores was not the beginning of partnership. It was the opening act of plunder. The so-called Age of Discovery was, for Africa, the Age of Invasion. The Portuguese, Dutch, French, and British brought not only goods but guns. They sought wealth, gold, ivory, spices, but soon realized Africa's greatest commodity would become its people. The transatlantic slave trade was born not of ignorance, but of calculated cruelty. This contact was never fair. Treaties were signed in languages foreign to African rulers, and broken the moment they were inconvenient. Missionaries softened the ground with scripture, and merchants followed with contracts. Behind them came soldiers, claiming land that had never belonged to them. Resistance was fierce, but disunity and deception were exploited with precision. Europe's presence did not develop Africa. It disfigured her. It introduced systems that drained labor and wealth, that fractured societies and erased histories. It sowed seeds of dependency, built structures of domination, and ensured that wealth flowed only one way: out. To understand modern Africa's struggles, we must trace the roots of exploitation to this moment, when partnership was abandoned for conquest. What they took cannot be counted in gold alone. They took futures. They took trust. They took time. When the world came for Africa, who spoke for her? The slave trade and the mechanism of dehumanization. What does it mean to strip a person of their name, their land, their story? It means more than slavery. It means erasing a soul. The transatlantic slave trade was one of the greatest crimes in human history. A system not just of labor, but of terror. Over 12 million Africans were ripped from their homes, chained, and thrown into floating tombs. Families were shattered, languages silenced, traditions erased. People were transformed into property, traded for sugar, cotton, and guns. But the wound was deeper than economic. It was spiritual, cultural, psychological. The goal was not only to extract labor, but to crush the memory of freedom. This system was supported by theology, law, and false science. Entire doctrines were invented to claim Africans were inferior, less than human, justifying the horrors aboard the ships and on the plantations. The dehumanization was global. Africans became commodities, and blackness itself was rewritten as a mark of servitude. Resistance came in many forms: revolts, maroon communities, hidden spiritual practices, but the trauma carved itself deep into the diaspora. The wealth built from this brutality seeded European empires and capitalist expansion. While African societies suffered collapse and depopulation, European cities grew fat on sugar and gold. The legacy of slavery is not confined to the past. It is embedded in global structures of race, wealth, and power today. The chains may be gone, but their imprint remains. They took our bodies. Then they took our image. But still we rise. Still we remember. Still we resist. We were never meant to survive. But we did. And we will. Colonialism and the rewriting of African histories. They conquered the land, but to rule the people, they had to conquer the mind. Colonialism was not just about borders and governments. It was about erasing identities and rewriting truths. Once the continent was carved up in the Berlin Conference, the colonizers moved swiftly to redefine what it meant to be African. History books were rewritten. Languages were banned. Indigenous knowledge systems were mocked or outlawed. Africa, the cradle of civilization, was portrayed as a dark, backward place, saved by Europe's civilizing mission. The colonizers built schools to produce servants, not thinkers. African students learned about European kings and explorers, but not about Sundiata, Askia, or Nzinga. They were taught to look outward for validation and upward to Europe for answers. Christianity was used to undermine traditional beliefs, and colonial languages replaced native tongues. A generation grew up alienated from their roots, taught to see themselves through the eyes of their oppressors. This rewriting of history was not accidental. It was strategic. If you control a people's memory, you control their future. Africa was not just colonized physically, it was colonized spiritually, intellectually, and emotionally. That legacy persists. Even today, many Africans know more about European capitals than their own ancient cities. Reclaiming our history is not nostalgia, it is resistance. Because if we do not tell our story, someone else will. And they will not tell it with love. They tried to bury us with lies, but we are digging up the truth. Every name remembered, every story reclaimed, is an act of revolution. To know our history is to know our power. Independence or illusion? The false promise of freedom. The drums of independence echoed across the continent. Flags replaced flags. Chains were broken, or so it seemed. The 1950s and 60s brought waves of independence to Africa. Ghana, Algeria, Nigeria, Congo, Kenya, one by one, the nations stood and declared themselves free. But the departure of European flags did not mean the end of European power. Political independence came, but economic and psychological liberation did not follow. Colonial administrators left, but their systems remained. African economies were still tied to the export of raw materials and the import of finished goods. Debt replaced chains. aid replaced self-determination. Foreign companies retained control of mines, oil fields, and farmlands. The illusion of freedom masked the continuation of dependency. And when African leaders dared to dream bigger, dared to nationalize resources, or challenge the global order, they were assassinated, overthrown, or isolated. Patrice Lumumba, Thomas Sankara, Amilcar Cabral. Their visions for a truly liberated Africa threatened the balance of Western interests. The people gained the right to vote, but were often handed weak institutions and borders drawn by colonizers. Ethnic divisions were exploited. Dictators were funded. Corruption was seeded and encouraged. Independence became a theater. The actors changed, but the script stayed the same. We won the battle for flags, but not the war for freedom. The chains are harder to see now, but they are there, in our economies, in our textbooks, in our dreams. True independence is not given. It must be built. What good is a free flag if your future is still for sale? Africa's unfinished liberation. Freedom was declared, but not delivered. Liberation began, but it has not ended. Africa's story did not stop with the departure of colonial flags. Across the continent, people continue to fight, not just against external forces, but internal ones. Corruption, neo-colonialism, economic dependency, but also against the lie that Africa cannot define her own future. This unfinished liberation is not a failure, it is a process. African thinkers, artists, revolutionaries, and youth are rewriting the script. Pan-Africanism breathes again in movements for unity. Traditional knowledge blends with innovation. The land speaks, and young Africans are listening. But old empires haven't left quietly. Structural adjustment programs, foreign debt, exploitative trade deals, Western media narratives, military bases, political interference. Africa's chains are now digital, financial, psychological, but they are no less real. Yet, in every village and city, there are those rising, building local economies, telling untold stories, fighting for justice. The soul of liberation lives on, not in speeches, but in struggle. Not in monuments, but in movements. Liberation is not an event. It is a decision, a daily act, a refusal to surrender to the systems built against us. This series does not end with answers, but with a challenge. Will this generation reclaim the promise? Will Africa rise, not to mimic the West, but to lead from her own center? They underdeveloped us, but they could not erase us. Now we rise, not in reaction, but in creation. Africa's future is not written. It will be carved by those who dare to finish what was started. We are not free until we free ourselves. They told us we were nothing, and we believed it for a time. But now, we remember. We remember the empires that stood before the empires, the knowledge buried but not lost, the dignity stolen but never destroyed. Africa's underdevelopment was no accident. It was a strategy. But so too can our rise be a strategy. We are not victims of history. We are authors of tomorrow. To reclaim Africa's future, we must reclaim her truth, her stories, her voice, and most of all, her power. This series is not the end. It is the beginning. A beginning for those who dare to see clearly, speak boldly, and build justly. Because the greatest revolution is to remember who we truly are. They tried to erase us, but we are the ink. Thank you for spending your time learning with us. If you discovered something new, please like, share, and subscribe. Turn on the bell so you won't miss more powerful stories.